The wind drags snow across a field of frozen corpses, their outlines half buried beneath a pale crust of ice. The distant rumble of artillery rolls through the steppe like thunder, and each explosion sends a flock of black crows screaming into the gray sky. Through the haze, a Soviet patrol moves cautiously among the ruins of a burned-out village, rifles raised, breath misting in the cold. The air smells of smoke, gunpowder, and something older, the decay of war itself. One of the soldiers hears a faint cry, not from pain, but fear. Beneath a shattered wall, they find a boy, 6 years old, barefoot, face streaked with soot. His small hands clutch a torn piece of bread. Around him lie the bodies of his mother and brother, civilians caught in the last German sweep through the area. The child does not cry anymore, he only stares. A sergeant kneels, wraps him in a military coat, and lifts him gently. The boy's name is Sergei. In his eyes, something flickers. Not yet hope, but the faint recognition of being alive. None of them knew that this small boy, barely taller than a rifle, would one day bring in a German general as his prisoner. The year was 1942, and the Eastern Front had become a landscape of extinction. Entire cities were being erased. Not conquered, not occupied, erased. The Wehrmacht's summer offensive, Case Blue, had cut deep into Soviet territory, reaching the Volga and the oil fields beyond. The Red Army, though battered, refused to break. But between the lines of strategy and supply, another war was raging. The war for human survival. Villages once filled with laughter were now reduced to smoking shells. The German advance left behind a trail of orphans, widows, and ruins. Soviet counteroffensives reclaimed some of this ground, but what they found was not liberation. It was silence. In places like Kaluga, Smolensk, and the Stalingrad Oblast, small children wandered among the wreckage of homes that no longer existed. Many were too young to understand what had happened. Others understood too well. The Soviet Union had been drawn into a total war, unlike any the world had ever seen. The Great Patriotic War, as it was called, demanded everything: steel, grain, men, and, eventually, the very innocence of its children. Civilians were drafted into labor, peasants became partisans, and even the young found themselves entangled in the machinery of survival. By the winter of 1942, as temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees Celsius, starvation set in behind the front lines. German occupation forces requisitioned food, livestock, and winter clothing. Disease followed hunger. Villagers dug through snow for frozen potatoes, burned furniture to stay warm, and buried their dead in shallow graves before the ground froze solid. For the Red Army soldiers advancing west, every reclaimed village told the same story: shattered homes, blood on the walls, and the eerie absence of life. And yet, sometimes, among the ruins, there were survivors. Children too weak to flee, too stubborn to die. This was how Sergei Aleshkov was found. He came from a small village in the Kaluga region, west of Moscow. When German troops swept through in late 1941, his father had already been killed at the front. His mother and older brother were executed by German soldiers accused of helping partisans. Sergei hid in a ditch for days before wandering into the forest, where Red Army scouts stumbled upon him weeks later, barely conscious, half-starved, and shivering. When the soldiers carried him back to their lines, they expected he would be sent to the rear, to an orphanage far from the front. But fate intervened. The 132nd Guards Rifle Regiment, under Major Kuznetsov, decided to keep him. They called him "our son," and he quickly became more than just a rescued child. At first, Sergei was given small tasks: fetching water, cleaning rifles, helping the medics. But his presence changed something in the men. Amid the endless gray of war, the laughter of a boy brought back a flicker of humanity. Soldiers began carving him toys out of wood, teaching him songs, and sharing their scarce rations. He was issued a miniature uniform, boots cut down to his size, and eventually, though never officially, a service weapon. War had stolen his family, but it had given him another, a regiment of fathers and brothers. To the outside observer, it seemed an absurd sight: a 6-year-old soldier walking among veterans hardened by years of combat. But, within the regiment, it was no absurdity at all. In the desolation of 1942, survival made its own rules. The war would soon teach Sergei that innocence was a luxury long lost. But before that day came, the child they called Little Guard had already begun to carry something far heavier than a rifle, the memory of everything he had lost. And as the Red Army turned the tide at Stalingrad, a new phase of the war began, one that would pull Sergei and his regiment deeper into the fire. By early 1943, the snow around Stalingrad had turned red. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's Eastern campaign, lay shattered. Over 90,000 men taken prisoner, tens of thousands more dead. For the first time since the invasion began, the Soviet Union could breathe. But what came after victory was not relief. It was revelation. The Red Army now advanced through the same villages it had lost, seeing firsthand what occupation had meant. In burned-out schools, soldiers found classrooms turned into barracks. Church altars had been used as firing positions, and always, among the debris, were the faces of children, eyes too old for their age, hollowed by hunger. The Soviet government began documenting them as children of the front. Some were sent to orphanages far behind the lines, while others, those found in combat zones, were unofficially adopted by units. They became mascots, runners, medics, and sometimes scouts. There were hundreds of such children scattered across the front. Valya Kotik, who would later become the youngest hero of the Soviet Union, Mayrat Kazy, who joined the partisans at 13, and Zina Portnova, who infiltrated German positions before being executed at 17. But Sergei Aleshkov was different. He was barely 6 years old when he joined the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment. He could not read or write. He barely spoke above a whisper, yet the men treated him with an affection that defied the brutality around them. Major Mikhail Kuznetsov, the regiment's commanding officer, took a particular interest in him. Kuznetsov himself had lost a family to the war and saw in Sergei not a symbol, but a son. The boy slept in the major's tent, ate from his mess tin, and followed him everywhere. "Our little fighter," the men would joke. But Sergei watched and learned how to recognize ranks, how to crawl under fire, how to carry messages between trenches when telephone lines were cut. These were not symbolic gestures. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, even a child could be useful. His small size allowed him to slip through ruins unnoticed. His speed and courage soon earned the respect of hardened soldiers. When he was sent to deliver dispatches under bombardment, he did so without hesitation. Some accounts from the regiment describe him warning of approaching enemy patrols, helping the medics retrieve wounded men, and even carrying ammunition belts through the mud when supply routes were under fire. Each act, small in scale, grew in legend as the months went by. But behind every tale of courage lay a quiet tragedy, a childhood erased. Sergei never played games. When he smiled, it was fleeting. The soldiers noticed this, but in war, everyone carried ghosts. In photographs taken later that year, Sergei appears in full uniform, a cap too large for his head, a faint smudge on his cheek. He stands beside the men of his regiment, men who, to him, were father, brother, and teacher all at once. The caption reads, "The youngest soldier of the Red Army." Yet what makes his story remarkable is not the propaganda image, but the truth behind it. Sergei was not trained nor coerced. He was simply there, a survivor who refused to vanish. Throughout 1943, as the Red Army pushed westward after the victory at Kursk, the regiment found itself in the thick of the fighting again. German resistance grew desperate. Ambushes, counterattacks, and long-range artillery fire turned every advance into a test of endurance. Amid this, Sergei's presence remained a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not ideology, not territory, but the right of their people, their children, to live. That year, he was awarded a medal for combat merit. Officially, it recognized his bravery in delivering messages and assisting under enemy fire. Unofficially, it recognized something far deeper, the indestructible will of a child who had already lost everything, yet still chose to stand with those who fought back. It would not be his last act of courage, because soon, in the thick forests of Belarus, Sergei would stumble upon something none of them expected. A German officer in retreat, alone, desperate, and unaware that the boy before him was no ordinary child. Aleshkov was about to change from a symbol of survival into a legend of defiance. To the men of the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment, Sergei was not a symbol of propaganda. He was a heartbeat in a world that had forgotten how to feel. Soldiers who had seen comrades vaporized by shellfire suddenly found themselves sewing mittens for a child, saving bits of sugar for him, teaching him how to march and salute. Letters from soldiers preserved in post-war archives often mention "our little son, Seryozha," as a source of strength. One private wrote, "When we look at him, we remember what we fight for. He is small, but he makes us feel human again." In the long nights between offensives, when frost crept through tents and artillery echoed across the horizon, Sergei would walk among them, checking if anyone was awake. Some said he'd whisper, "Sleep, uncle, I'll watch." It was never clear if he meant it, or if the soldiers simply imagined it, a child's voice cutting through the darkness. To those men, Sergei embodied something sacred, the unbroken thread of home, family, and the innocent life that the war was devouring. In the midst of destruction, he was proof that not everything human had perished. War ages people, but for a child, it distorts time entirely. Sergei had lost the structure of childhood, school, play, family, and was thrust into an environment of constant danger. Psychologists who later studied children of the front lines noted how many developed traits of accelerated maturity: emotional suppression, hyper-awareness, and instinctive fearlessness. Sergei was no exception. He rarely cried. He followed orders with precision, and yet, behind his obedience, there was still a child, one who flinched at the sight of dead animals, who hid behind the major during heavy shelling, and who smiled only when the regiment's dog, a mutt named Sharik, came running to him. The men shielded him as best they could, but the front was no place for innocence. The smell of gunpowder, the sound of screams, the endless funerals, they became his normal. What war did to men in years, it did to Sergei in months. And still, he adapted. He learned how to read from old newspapers. He memorized the names of fallen comrades, reciting them quietly as if preserving their memory. For the soldiers, it was heartbreaking to see such focus in a child. For Sergei, it was survival. In time, he no longer seemed out of place. He was one of them, not by age, but by endurance. The front lines of the Eastern Front were fluid, chaotic, and dangerous. Lines of communication often broke down under bombardment, and reconnaissance could mean the difference between holding a position or being encircled. This is where Sergei's courage took on a tangible form. Small, quick, and often unnoticed, he became an unofficial messenger and observer. When German artillery cut the telephone wires connecting forward trenches to headquarters, he would crawl under fire to deliver written messages. Witnesses from the 142nd later testified that he did so multiple times during engagements near Velikie Luki and Kirovograd. His size and agility made him invisible to snipers. German observers often mistook him for a local child scavenging for food. That illusion became a weapon. On one occasion, when Soviet scouts were pinned down by German machine gun fire, Sergei slipped through a gully, crossed the no-man's land, and brought back the enemy's position, scribbled on a piece of paper. Tactically, these small actions mattered. The regiment's movements improved, artillery fire became more precise, and morale rose knowing that even a boy risked his life beside them. His courage was not symbolic. It had measurable results on the field. He was eventually issued a toy pistol, but soldiers later replaced it with a real sidearm, a small TT pistol, though he was rarely allowed to carry ammunition. To the regiment, it was ceremonial, but to Sergei, it was proof that he belonged. The line between mascot and soldier had vanished. If Sergei's story had a heart, it was Major Mikhail Kuznetsov. The officer was known for his calm discipline and fairness, but with the boy, his demeanor softened completely. The two were rarely seen apart. Kuznetsov ensured Sergei had food, clothing, and even a place in the regiment's photographs. In letters later recovered, Kuznetsov referred to him as "my son of the front." He refused to send Sergei away, even when higher command advised it. "He has no one else," Kuznetsov wrote. "If he leaves, he will die. If he stays, he lives with us." Their relationship became the emotional anchor of the entire regiment. Soldiers joked that the boy was the major's shadow, but during the fighting near the Dnieper, when a shell struck close to Kuznetsov's trench, It was Sergei who helped drag him to safety, clutching his coat and shouting for the medics. That act, a 6-year-old saving his commanding officer, spread through the regiment like fire. From then on, no one questioned his place among them. The soldiers of the 182nd Guards Regiment would go on to fight across Ukraine and into Belarus, but always with their little guard close behind. And it was during one of these operations, deep in the forests and broken villages of Belarus in late 1943, that the boy would make the act that turned legend into history. A scouting patrol gone wrong, a shadow moving through the trees, and a moment when a 6-year-old soldier spotted something no one else did. By the winter of 1943, the war had transformed the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment into a hardened, disciplined fighting force. But even among its ranks, the story of their little guard began to travel beyond their sector. War correspondents, political officers, and nearby divisions had heard of the child soldier who carried dispatches under fire, who laughed among the dying, who had become the symbol of endurance. But behind every story of heroism, there are other sides. The enemy's disbelief, the leadership's moral dilemmas, and the eternal question of what war does to the human soul. When German prisoners or intelligence units first heard rumors of a Soviet child on the front lines, they dismissed it as propaganda. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed absurd, a sign of desperation, not strength. Reports from intercepted communications and later testimonies reveal German officers calling such stories fabrications of Bolshevik morale. But among lower-ranked soldiers, whispers began to spread. Some swore they had seen a small figure in a Soviet uniform darting between craters during skirmishes. One captured German lieutenant, interrogated after a failed counterattack, said that his men had fired upon what appeared to be a boy carrying messages. Thinking at first it was a decoy. The idea unsettled them. The German army had its own Hitler Youth, but they were not yet deployed on the front lines. To face a real child in combat, on the enemy's side, blurred something deep in the psyche. It stripped the war of its supposed order, its illusion of professionalism. For the Germans, it was a psychological wound that the Soviets, even their children, refused to submit. For the Soviets, it was a grim badge of pride, proof that even their smallest citizens were part of the struggle. And for Sergei, unaware of the fear his presence provoked, it was simply another day on the line. Inside the Soviet ranks, Sergei's story presented a moral contradiction that few dared to voice. Officially, the Red Army forbade children under 16 from frontline service. Yet, across the Eastern Front, commanders quietly bent the rule, especially for orphans who had nowhere else to go. When Major Kuznetsov first reported Sergei to regimental command, he described him as a foundling assistant. The report omitted any mention of combat activity, but as Sergei's reputation grew, his bravery carrying messages, his rescue of Kuznetsov, word reached the division's political department. Propaganda officers saw opportunity. A child who had suffered under the Germans and now fought beside his Soviet brothers was the perfect image of unity and resilience. Soon, Sergei was photographed, his face appearing in Red Army newspapers with captions like, "Son of the Regiment." It inspired thousands, yet within the regiment, the men knew the truth was not so clean. They admired his courage, but they also worried. In moments of silence, some asked, was it right for a child to live among guns and death? Kuznetsov carried that question more heavily than anyone. He could have sent Sergei to the rear, but each time the idea surfaced, the boy refused. "If you go," Sergei once said, "I go too." For Kuznetsov, there was no argument after that. Thus, the line between protection and exploitation blurred, not out of cruelty, but out of love and necessity. Sergei had become part of the machine of survival, and no one, not even his commanding officer, could pull him out. In every war, the most invisible casualty is innocence. Sergei's story illuminates this with devastating clarity. For the soldiers, his laughter reminded them of life beyond the trenches. For Sergei himself, there was no beyond. His entire existence was confined to mud, fire, and fear. Historians often debate the ethics of children in wartime, but for the people who lived through it, such questions were meaningless. War did not ask for permission. It demanded endurance. Sergei's presence became both a comfort and a warning. He was proof that war had no boundaries left. It consumed everything: cities, families, and now even childhood. The soldiers noticed changes in him. He began walking with his hands behind his back, mimicking officers. He learned to curse like the men. When someone died, he didn't cry. He just stood silently, cap pressed against his chest. To outsiders, this might have seemed stoic. To those who knew him, it was tragic. Yet, within that tragedy lay something extraordinary. Sergei's courage was not born from anger or ideology, but from attachment. He loved the men who saved him, and that love made him fearless. He wasn't fighting against the Germans. He was fighting for the people who had become his family. After the war, Soviet culture would turn stories like Sergei's into myths, symbols of collective strength. But during the conflict itself, these children were neither heroes nor symbols. They were human reminders of how far the world had fallen. In later decades, films like Son of the Regiment, 1946, would fictionalize Sergei's experience, turning it into an uplifting tale of patriotism. The real boy, however, lived through something far more complex, a story not of propaganda, but of survival in its rawest form. His photograph, small and grainy, became iconic in military museums across the USSR. It showed a boy smiling faintly in oversized boots, unaware that history had turned him into an emblem. Yet, in that same smile was everything the Soviet soldier fought for: the chance for their children to live without ever holding a rifle. By the end of 1943, Sergei's regiment had been redeployed to Belarus, tasked with clearing remnants of German resistance. It was there, amid dense pine forests and the smoke of burned villages, that the child who had survived loss, endured fire, and carried messages under shelling would face the moment that defined his legend: a patrol, a noise in the trees, and a flash of gray uniform. The boy they called Little Guard was about to do the impossible. The war had shifted westward, but the ground here was still soaked with the blood of 2 years fighting. The trees bore the scars: splintered trunks, shrapnel embedded deep, branches stripped by machine gun fire. Every step the Red Army took toward Poland was contested by remnants of the German Army Group Center, retreating but not defeated. The 152nd Guards Rifle Regiment had been tasked with advancing through the dense woodland near the village of Kolm-Jerkovsky, sweeping for isolated German positions and snipers left behind after the Soviet breakthrough. To the men, it was another exhausting push: long marches, short rations, and constant danger from ambushes. For Sergei Aleshkov, now 7 years old, it was the only life he knew. His small frame was hidden beneath a standard-issue overcoat, sleeves rolled up, boots still too big. He followed his regiment closely, carrying a small satchel and his prized pistol. Major Mikhail Kuznetsov rode at the head of the column, eyes scanning the tree line. The war had taught him that the most dangerous battles were the quiet ones. No artillery, no shouting, only wind moving through the branches. That morning, a thin mist hung low over the ground. The unit halted at the edge of a clearing, where scouts reported movement. Perhaps civilians. Perhaps stragglers. A small reconnaissance group was sent forward. Among them, without permission, slipped Sergei. He moved instinctively, low to the ground, copying the posture of the scouts he idolized. His breath came in short puffs of white vapor. Around him, silence pressed in. Then, a sound. A twig snapping. Not from ahead, but behind. Sergei turned. Through the mist, he saw a shadow, tall, gray, and moving quickly between the trees, the outline of a German officer, disheveled but armed. The man was trying to slip past the Soviet patrol unnoticed, heading toward the river where other retreating units might be hiding. For a moment, Sergei froze. The instinct of any child, fear, surged through him. But years of living at the front had stripped away hesitation. He crouched behind a fallen log and waited. When the figure drew closer, Sergei stood up, pointed his small pistol, and shouted in a voice too high for the battlefield. "Halt!" The officer stopped, startled not by the command, but by who had given it. In front of him stood a child, no older than 7, uniform torn, face streaked with mud, holding a weapon that looked almost like a toy. The man hesitated. He could have raised his rifle, could have fired. But shock has its own physics. It freezes the body. At that moment, Sergei's shout drew the attention of nearby scouts. Within seconds, rifles were raised, boots thundered through the mud, and the German found himself surrounded. When they disarmed him, they realized this was no ordinary officer. His uniform carried the insignia of a general major, a general. His sidearm was engraved, his map case detailed with hand-drawn positions of German fallback lines. The men were stunned. Word spread quickly through the regiment. The boy caught a German general. In the official reports that followed, the name of the captured officer would not always be recorded consistently. Wartime documentation was chaotic, and many Soviet records remain fragmentary. But witness accounts from the 152nd Guards Rifle Regiment confirmed that the incident was real. The general had been cut off from his command group during the Soviet advance and was attempting to escape through the forest when Sergei's sharp eyes spotted him. When Major Kuznetsov arrived at the scene, he found Sergei standing proudly beside the captured officer, pistol still in hand. Mud covered his uniform, and his small chest heaved with adrenaline. Kuznetsov knelt beside him. "What happened, Seryozha?" The boy shrugged. "He was running. I told him to stop." The soldiers around them laughed, not mockingly, but in disbelief. In a war that had seen every imaginable horror, this small moment of impossible bravery felt like something out of legend. That day, the regiment halted its advance to process the prisoner. The general's capture provided critical intelligence, maps and documents showing the remnants of German defenses in the sector. It confirmed Soviet estimates that the enemy was in full retreat. But, to the men, it was more than a tactical victory. It was a story, one they would tell for years, around fires and in barracks, about the boy who refused to be a victim of war. That night, as the regiment bivouacked near a half-ruined farmhouse, the soldiers sat around Sergei, teasing and praising him in equal measure. Someone placed a general's epaulet on his cap as a joke. Sergei grinned shyly, then fell asleep against Kuznetsov's shoulder, exhausted. The war had seen heroes of every kind, tank commanders, snipers, partisans, but none like this. A boy who had once hidden in the ruins of his burned village had now done what few men ever could. In the vast machinery of the Eastern Front, it was a small event. But within the hearts of the men who saw it, it was enormous. For Sergei, it was not triumph he felt that night, only peace. He had done what the war had taught him to do: survive, act, protect. And as dawn broke the next day, the regiment moved west again, deeper into the fire. The boy's legend, however, had just begun to spread, from one regiment to another, and eventually across the entire front. The next morning broke cold and gray, the forest still damp from the night frost. Smoke from the soldiers' campfires twisted through the birch branches as the 152nd Guards Regiment prepared to move out. The captured German officer, tall, broad, and visibly shaken, was marched through the camp under guard. His uniform, once pristine, was now stained with mud and humiliation. And walking beside him, clutching his small pistol in both hands, was Sergei Aleshkov. The soldiers watched the unlikely pair in silence. Some smiled, others simply shook their heads. It was a sight that defied logic. A general of the Wehrmacht, prisoner to a child barely past his 6th birthday. Word of the capture spread rapidly. Officers from neighboring regiments came to verify it themselves, doubting the reports until they saw the boy with their own eyes. The story soon reached divisional headquarters, and from there, the press. By the time Soviet correspondents arrived days later, Sergei's name was already being whispered as a symbol of the Red Army's resilience. But for those who were there, the moment was not about propaganda. It was about survival, courage, and something deeper. The strange fusion of innocence and war that Sergei embodied. When Major Kuznetsov received the first formal telegram from headquarters commending his unit, he refused to let it become spectacle. He made sure the boy was fed first, warmed by the fire, and then told everyone, "Remember, he's not a mascot. He's one of us." That evening, Kuznetsov took Sergei aside. The general's capture had shaken even him. It had been a lucky intersection of instinct and fate. He wanted to praise the boy, but the words caught in his throat. What do you say to a child who has done what soldiers dream of, in a war no child should ever see? Instead, he simply handed Sergei a biscuit from his ration pack and said softly, "You did well, son." Sergei looked at him, uncertain. "Will they send me away now?" Kuznetsov hesitated. "No," he said finally. "You stay with us. we still need our little guard. In the days that followed, the regiment continued its push through Belarus, securing small towns and cutting off retreating German pockets. The story of the boy who captured a general followed them wherever they went. War reporters arrived, scribbling notes as Sergei posed awkwardly beside the men, small, shy, his oversized cap shading his eyes. He was photographed holding a rifle, standing beside the captured general's map case. The image, when published, would become one of the most famous photographs of the Soviet front. A boy in a soldier's coat, his expression serious, his posture proud, the ruins of war behind him. The Soviet press called him the youngest soldier of victory. But among the regiment, he was simply Seryozha, the boy who wouldn't give up. The capture itself became more than a military anecdote. It carried immense symbolic weight. For the men, it was proof that the war had turned, that even fate itself seemed to have chosen their side. For propaganda officers, it was gold, a story of defiance, innocence, and triumph against tyranny. And for Sergei, it was the moment his life stopped being private. He began receiving letters, hundreds of them, from soldiers at other fronts, from children in Leningrad, from mothers who wrote, "If my son is lost, I hope he is as brave as you." He didn't know how to read them all, but Kuznetsov would sometimes sit with him by the fire, reading the words aloud until Sergei fell asleep. Yet, amid the new fame, war remained relentless. The regiment faced heavy fighting during the liberation of Kirovograd in early 1944. German counterattacks grew more ferocious, artillery more precise. In one bombardment, a shell struck dangerously close to the command post. Major Kuznetsov was wounded, and again, Sergei was there. Ignoring orders to stay down, he ran through smoke and debris to reach his commander, pulling at his uniform, shouting for the medics. The sight of that small figure dragging a wounded officer through the mud became seared into the memories of those who witnessed it. Kuznetsov survived, thanks in part to the boy who had once been just a starving orphan. In the following months, Sergei was officially awarded the Medal for Combat Merit by order of the regimental command. The citation, signed in neat military handwriting, read, "For bravery and resourcefulness shown in the capture of an enemy officer and for service rendered under fire." During the ceremony, soldiers lined up in formation. Sergei stood in front, cap in hand, trembling slightly as the medal was pinned to his uniform. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. Kuznetsov saluted him. The men cheered. Someone began to sing softly, the same soldier's song they had taught Sergei months ago. It was a moment of joy, but also of sorrow, because every man there knew that, for a child to earn such a medal, the world had already failed him. That winter, when the regiment rotated to the rear for rest, Sergei was finally sent to a military academy, not as punishment or exile, but as protection. Kuznetsov wanted him to live beyond the war. He promised to visit, to write, to keep him safe until peace returned. As the train pulled away from the frontline station, Sergei stood by the window, saluting the men who had become his family. They saluted back, rifles raised, knowing the boy who had once walked barefoot through ruins had now walked into legend. For the 142nd Guards Rifle Regiment, the war continued. Many of its men would fall in Poland, some would march all the way to Berlin. But the story of that small boy, the one who captured a general, would follow them forever, carried like a secret talisman through fire and death. In a war measured by millions of lives lost, one child's courage reminded them why they still fought. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the hope that no child would ever again need to wear a soldier's uniform. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. Cities were rubble, nations divided, and millions displaced. The Soviet Union, victorious but scarred, counted its dead in tens of millions. Among the medals and parades, the human stories, those of survival and quiet courage, became the real legacy of the Great Patriotic War. And among those stories, one name remained whispered with a strange tenderness across the Red Army. Sergei Aleshkov, the boy who captured a general. After being sent to the Sverdlovsk-Suvorov Military School, Sergei struggled to adjust to a world without gunfire. The academy, founded for war orphans and young cadets, was a world of order, discipline, and routine, a world that must have felt alien to someone who had spent his childhood running between trenches. For the first time, he slept in a real bed, ate hot meals every day, and woke not to the whistle of shells, but to the sound of a bugle. But the shadows of war did not leave easily. In letters preserved by his fellow cadets, Sergei was described as quiet, withdrawn, always serious. He kept a small photograph of his regiment, the 142nd Guards, in his pocket, folded so many times that the creases split the paper. He never spoke of his parents. When asked, he would simply say, "They were brave." Major Mikhail Kuznetsov kept his promise. He visited Sergei whenever possible, bringing gifts from the front and updates about the men. Their bond, forged in battle, endured through peace. Kuznetsov called him "my son." And for Sergei, that title meant more than any medal. In post-war interviews, Kuznetsov once said, "He reminded us that even in war, we were still human. That was his greatest service." But peace was not simple. The Soviet Union quickly moved from victory to reconstruction. The stories of its heroes were collected, polished, and printed, often shaped to fit the state's narrative of unity and sacrifice. Sergei's story became one of these. In 1946, the film Son of the Regiment premiered, inspired directly by his life. The story followed a young orphan boy who finds a new family among soldiers, helping them through battles and symbolizing the Soviet spirit. Audiences wept. The film became a cornerstone of Soviet wartime memory, and the real Sergei Aleshkov, then barely 10 years old, was invited to screenings as an honored guest. Yet those who knew him said he watched in silence, recognizing fragments of his life, but also feeling the weight of what had been changed, the simplifications, the sentimentality, the way tragedy had been turned into myth. In reality, there was no triumphant music when he walked through the ruins of his village, no applause when he found his mother's body. His story was not about glory. It was about survival. Still, the film and the publicity that followed brought him a strange kind of immortality. Across the Soviet Union, schools and youth organizations told his story as an example of courage. "Be like Sergei Aleshkov," the posters read. Few understood the pain behind those words. As the years passed, Sergei grew into a young man. He remained in the military academy system, eventually training as a law officer, determined, perhaps unconsciously, to bring justice to a world that had once taken everything from him. Those who served with him described him as composed, intelligent, and deeply loyal. He rarely spoke of the war, but when asked about his regiment, he would smile faintly and say, "They were my family." He carried the same discipline into his adult life, serving as a prosecutor in Chelyabinsk Oblast, far from the front lines where his story had begun. To his colleagues, he was quiet but commanding, a man with eyes that seemed older than his years. He never married. Friends later said he often spoke of Major Kuznetsov as if he were still alive, long after the major had passed away. By the time the Soviet Union entered the nuclear age, the story of the Little Guard had already become folklore. Schoolbooks mentioned him briefly, war museums displayed his photographs, and veterans told his story to younger generations. Yet the boy himself, now a man, lived a life of quiet service, content to fade into the ordinary rhythms of peace, something he had earned more than anyone. But history has a way of circling back. In the 1970s, a journalist rediscovered his story, seeking him out for a retrospective on wartime childhood. Sergei agreed to one interview. When asked how it felt to be called a hero, he paused for a long time before replying, "Heroes die. I lived." His answer was not modesty. It was truth. He had seen too much, survived too much, to romanticize it. And yet, for all his humility, his name continued to echo quietly through generations of Russians who grew up hearing about the boy who once captured a German general, not as a soldier of glory, but as a child of endurance. The war may have ended on paper, but for those who had lived its horror, the silence that followed was its own kind of battlefield. For Sergei Aleshkov, peace was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of remembering. He never returned to the ruins of his home village. There was nothing left there to return to, no graves to visit, no family to embrace. The forests where he had once hidden were long cleared for farming, the ground tilled and sown over the past. Only the veterans who had fought beside him remained as living witnesses to his story, and even they, one by one, faded away. In the years that followed, The Soviet Union buried its pain beneath ceremony and reconstruction. Victory Day parades rolled through Red Square, the hammer and sickle flew high, and songs of triumph filled the air. Yet, beneath that surface, millions carried quiet scars. Some, like Sergei, wore them invisibly, hidden behind calm eyes and careful posture. He continued his service to the state, not as a soldier, but as a prosecutor, a man dedicated to law and order. Colleagues described him as precise and fair, always calm under pressure, always respectful of those who came before him. To those who knew his past, it was almost poetic. The boy who had lived through the chaos of war, now devoted to justice and discipline. But even in peace, traces of his past never truly left him. Those close to him said he sometimes woke in the night, walking the halls of his small apartment, as if listening for distant sounds, the echo of artillery, the cries of soldiers. Others recalled how every Victory Day, he would polish his small collection of medals, set them neatly on his desk, and pour a glass of vodka beside them. He never drank it. He just sat in silence for a while, then carefully put everything away. His relationship with Major Mikhail Kuznetsov remained the cornerstone of his life. The man who had once carried him out of the ruins had become, in every sense, his father. Their correspondence continued for years after the war, letters full of simple words. "Are you well, my son?" and "I miss you, father." When Kuznetsov died in the early 1950s, Sergei traveled across the country to attend his funeral. Witnesses said he stood beside the grave in full uniform, saluted, and whispered only one sentence: "You kept me alive. I'll make it mean something." From that day onward, he seldom spoke of the war again. Yet the legend he left behind grew larger than the man himself. His story appeared in wartime anthologies, school readers, and veterans' memoirs. Across generations, Soviet children learned about the youngest soldier of the Red Army, who once captured a German general. To some, it sounded like myth. To others, it was proof that the will to fight could outlive even childhood. In reality, Sergei never saw himself that way. When asked years later about his so-called heroism, he said quietly, "I was not a soldier. I was just a boy who wanted to stay alive." That honesty was rare, and it cut deeper than any patriotic slogan ever could. In 1990, as the Soviet Union stood on the brink of dissolution, Sergei Aleshkov passed away in Chelyabinsk, aged 54. The newspapers barely mentioned it. No grand funerals, no state honors, just a short notice, a photograph, and a handful of old comrades who remembered the small boy with the big heart. But history does not forget easily. Today his face still appears in museums and documentaries, his story retold in classrooms and memorials. The medals he earned as a child soldier rest quietly in glass cases. One tiny uniform, one small cap, one oversized pair of boots, preserved as reminders of what war demanded of even the youngest. Visitors who see them often smile first, surprised that such a small uniform could belong to someone who lived through such vast destruction. Then, almost always, their smiles fade, because in those relics lies a haunting truth, that innocence can survive war. But it never returns unscarred. Sergei Aleshkov's life was not about the glory of battle or the symbolism of victory. It was about the persistence of the human heart, the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to carry love even through the darkest hours of history. He began as a child no one noticed, a shadow among ruins. He became a symbol no one could forget. The story of Sergei Aleshkov is not a tale of heroism in the way war so often demands. It is instead a mirror, reflecting what happens when humanity is forced to grow too soon. In the archives of the Great Patriotic War, his name appears only a handful of times. A few lines in regimental reports, a photograph, a medal citation. Yet those small traces speak louder than any speech or monument. They remind us that war is not fought only by armies or nations, but by lives caught in its path, lives so fragile they should never have known its noise. Sergei's courage was never about vengeance or ideology. He did not fight for glory or to earn medals. He fought because he had nothing left but the men who took him in, because survival itself had become his only form of resistance. In that, his story holds a truth larger than any battlefield victory. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep living despite it. When the 142nd Guards Regiment marched west, The men carried rifles, rations, and photographs of home. Sergei carried none of those. He carried their hope, the belief that something human still existed amid the ash. In every trench he crossed, every message he delivered, every breath he took beside them, he proved that hope could still stand upright. Even in a child's frame, time has softened the noise of that war. The guns have rusted, the uniforms lie behind glass, and the fields once filled with death now grow green again. But among those memories stands the figure of a small boy in an oversized coat, his face solemn, his gaze unwavering. He is the reminder that history's greatest measure is not how men fight, but how they protect what little innocence remains. Sergei Aleshkov did not grow up wanting to be a soldier. War chose him. And yet, by refusing to let it break him, he became something more enduring than any conqueror, a symbol of life's quiet defiance against the machinery of destruction. The child they ignored became the conscience of a generation that had forgotten what innocence was. And in the silence that followed victory, his story still whispers that even in war's darkest hour, the smallest heart can carry the weight of a nation.